there is a photograph from Lisbon's Alfama district, taken sometime in the early 2000s, before the world discovered it. Old women in black dresses sitting on limestone steps. Laundry strung between buildings the color of faded mustard. A man playing fado from a window that had not been repainted in 30 years. The photograph looked like poverty. It was not poverty. It was a neighborhood that had been inhabited continuously by the same kinds of families for 500 years. Now look at what occupies those steps. Boutique hotel guests with rolling luggage. Couples consulting apps to find the best viewpoint for a photograph that will prove they were there. Vacation apartments behind coded lockboxes, their windows lit at odd hours by strangers who will be gone by Sunday. The laundry is gone. The women in black are gone. The fado comes now from speakers installed in restaurants that serve a version of bacalhau optimized for Northern European palates and priced accordingly. The official story is that Lisbon was saved, that tourism rescued a city the European financial crisis had brought to its knees, that the Golden Visa program and the digital nomad wave and the Airbnb revolution turned a dying city into one of the most desirable destinations on the continent. That story is not false. It is simply incomplete in ways that matter enormously, because what happened in Lisbon did not happen only in Lisbon, and what is continuing to happen, quietly, gradually, in ways that do not generate crisis headlines because there is no single catastrophic event to photograph, is unfolding in capital after capital across Europe, not the dramatic collapse that historians will date precisely. The other kind, the kind where a city remains beautiful and full of visitors and economically measurable as successful, while the thing that made it a city rather than a stage set disappears. One family at a time, one young person's departure at a time, one generation's decision not to return at a time. This is the story of 10 European capitals that are losing themselves, not to war, not to plague, not to the economic catastrophes that fill textbooks, to something quieter and in some ways more final. Lisbon understood, long before the economists confirmed it, that there is a price for becoming desirable to the world. The city spent much of the 20th century as Europe's forgotten corner. Salazar's decades of authoritarian isolation, followed by a revolution in 1974, and then the long, complicated process of becoming a modern democracy, left Portugal perpetually a half step behind the Western European mainstream. Lisbon was, by the standards of Paris or Amsterdam or Barcelona, charmingly behind, which is another way of saying it was still itself. The financial crisis of 2010 changed the frame entirely. With sovereign debt at crisis levels and unemployment approaching 15%, Portugal opened its economy to foreign capital in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The non-habitual resident tax regime, the Golden Visa program, the progressive loosening of planning restrictions on short-term rental conversion, each policy was individually defensible. The aggregate effect was the systematic repricing of Lisbon's residential stock from the level at which Lisboetas could afford it to the level at which investors and tourists could. By 2019, a two-bedroom apartment in Moraria, a neighborhood that had housed working families for centuries, was renting at rates that consumed 90% of the median Portuguese salary. The families in those apartments were not being evicted by decree. They were being displaced by arithmetic. When your landlord can earn in a week from an Airbnb listing what you pay in a month, the market does not need to be cruel. It simply needs to be rational. What left with those families was not merely demographic data. It was the intergenerational fabric of neighborhoods that had been built over centuries. The grandmother who knew which baker still made the bread the old way, the neighborhood festa that required a neighborhood to exist, the informal social infrastructure that cities produce when they have time, and which cannot be reconstructed by urban planning initiatives, no matter how well funded or well intentioned. What replaced it was not nothing. But what replaced it was a different thing, oriented toward a different purpose, serving a different constituency. And that constituency, however affluent and appreciative, is not the constituency of a living city. It is the constituency of a very good hotel that happens to occupy the coordinates of what used to be one. Athens carries a different weight. Heavier, perhaps, because it is older. The city has been sitting at the center of Western civilization's self-narrative for so long that it has developed a kind of immunity to its own significance. The Parthenon is there every morning. It will be there after everything else changes. The permanence of that fact has a way of making more recent transformations look temporary by comparison. They are not. The Greek financial crisis of 2010 through 2018, the full 8 years of it, not the condensed version that made international headlines for the first three, did something to Athens that mere economic hardship cannot fully explain. It did not simply impoverish the city, it educated it in hopelessness. A generation of Greeks who had done precisely what they were told to do, studied, earned degrees, built professional credentials in medicine and engineering and architecture and law, discovered that those credentials had market value everywhere in Europe except the country that had produced them. The statistics are not secret. Between 2010 and 2018, an estimated 400,000 Greeks emigrated. The majority were between 25 and 40. The majority had university degrees. Many had postgraduate qualifications. The countries that received them, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, the United States, received skilled professionals who arrived trained and ready to contribute to economies that had not paid for their education. Greece received remittances and periodic visits at Easter, and nothing else. What brain drain means in practice is not simply an absence of young people, it is an absence of the specific future that those young people would have generated had they stayed. The hospital that would have been staffed by the doctor who left for Berlin, the architecture firm that would have redesigned Athenian neighborhoods that are instead falling into expensive stasis, the startup that would have employed the programmer who moved to Amsterdam, the school where the teacher who decamped to London would have formed the next generation. Athens recovered. The tourism numbers confirm this emphatically. The Acropolis Museum, which opened in 2009 just before the crisis, is one of the great modern museum buildings in Europe and draws visitors in numbers that would have seemed impossible in the dark years that followed. The city's neighborhoods, Monastiraki, Koukaki, Kypseli, have become genuinely fashionable, written up in the same travel publications that once dismissed Athens as a city to pass through on the way to the islands. But the young Greeks who are coming back, and some are coming back, are returning to a different city than the one they left. They are arriving as gentrifiers in their own hometown. They are opening wine bars in neighborhoods where their cousins could no longer afford rent. The cultural revival is real, and it is being built on a demographic foundation that has a significant and perhaps unreplaceable gap in the middle of it. Rome presents a different kind of problem. Not collapse in the conventional sense, not the dramatic visible failure of infrastructure or institutions, something more insidious and harder to address precisely because it operates beneath the threshold of crisis. Rome is a city that has been living off its inheritance for so long that the habit has become structural. The inheritance is extraordinary. No honest person disputes this. The density of historical and artistic significance packed into Rome's 22 square miles exceeds that of any other city in the world by a margin that defies reasonable comparison. The Pantheon, the Colosseum, the Forum, the Vatican, the Borghese Gallery, the list goes on for so long that it becomes numbing, which is itself part of the problem. When a city's primary economic asset is a collection of things built between 500 BC and 1600 AD, the incentive structure for maintaining and improving contemporary infrastructure becomes profoundly distorted. Why invest in the metro system when the tourists who sustain the economy are not primarily using the metro system? Why address the chronic dysfunction of municipal governance, the waste collection crises, the potholed roads, the building permits that take years, the public spaces that are beautiful and unusable, when the fundamental commercial offer of the city does not depend on those things functioning correctly? The answer is that young Romans depend on those things functioning correctly. The architect who wants to build a practice in Rome needs permits to be issued in weeks, not years. The entrepreneur who wants to open a restaurant needs reliable suppliers and a functional regulatory environment. The doctor who wants to work in Roman medicine needs a hospital system that is not perpetually in administrative crisis. When those things do not function, the calculation that Athens' generation performed, stay or leave, is performed in Rome as well. With increasing frequency and decreasing hesitation, Rome has not emptied the way Athens emptied. The scale of the city makes that kind of dramatic departure less legible even when it is occurring. But the pattern in the data is consistent. The population of Rome's historic center has been declining for decades. The youngest age cohort is persistently underrepresented. The startups, the new restaurants, the creative industries that in other European cities cluster in former industrial neighborhoods are in Rome, clustered in a few enclaves that feel distinctly separate from the wider dysfunction of the city around them. Rome is a city with two realities operating simultaneously: the extraordinary stage set that draws 40 million visitors a year, and the administrative, functional, daily life reality that those visitors do not see because it is not what they came for. The stage set is magnificent. The other reality is driving the people who have to inhabit both of them towards cities where only one reality needs to be navigated. Dublin offers the most disorienting version of this story because it refuses the narrative frame that the other cities provide. Dublin is not economically depressed. Dublin is not losing educated people to other countries. Dublin is not suffering from the failure of its model. Dublin is suffering from the success of its model. The Irish economic transformation of the late 1980s and 1990s, the original Celtic Tiger period, was genuine. Ireland's decision to price itself as the English-speaking, low-tax European base for American technology and pharmaceutical companies generated economic growth that was not illusory in the way that some of the housing bubble growth that followed it was. Google, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Pfizer, they are all headquartered in Ireland for structural tax reasons, and they are all real businesses employing real people at real salaries in and around Dublin. Those salaries have done something to Dublin that no boom could have been expected to prevent, but that no one in the 1990s would have predicted. They have made it one of the most expensive cities in Europe for people who do not work for a multinational technology company. The median Irish salary is not the median Google salary. The rent that a Dublin apartment commands in a market defined by the upper end of the technology compensation scale is not a rent that a nurse or a teacher or a social worker or a small business owner can meet from their income. The people being displaced are not visible in the economic data as displaced. They appear, if they appear at all, as people living in commuter towns 40 minutes from the city or in new housing developments built in areas that were fields a decade ago, or in the emigration statistics that have never quite stopped even during the boom years. They are living the Irish experience that has defined every Irish generation since the famine. The country produces people faster than it can create conditions for those people to remain. In a new and peculiarly modern form, where the country itself is thriving while its native working class is being priced out of the capital that the thriving is centered on. What Dublin's is losing is not measurable by the usual instruments because Dublin is not failing. What it is losing is the specific texture of a city that was shaped by its own people over generations. The working class neighborhoods that produced the writers and the musicians and the storytellers that made Dublin's culture what it was are now neighborhoods of short-term rentals and corporate apartments. The pubs where those cultures were sustained are now either closed or adapted for tourist consumption. The intergenerational continuity, the grandmother who lived in the same street as her own grandmother, has been interrupted by an economics that has no mechanism for valuing it. Displacement without decline. A city remaining vibrant for the people who can afford to inhabit it, empty for the people who made it what it was. Riga and Vilnius require a different vocabulary because their situation involves a different scale of departure and a different set of causes. Though the destination is recognizably the same place, the Baltic capitals are, by most conventional measures, success stories of the post-Soviet transition. Both countries rebuilt functional democratic institutions after 1991 with remarkable speed. Both joined the European Union in 2004 and the Eurozone in subsequent years. Both have rebuilt historic city centers that are genuinely beautiful and were recognized as such by UNESCO. Both have developed technology sectors and startup ecosystems that are disproportionately sophisticated relative to their size. And both are emptying. Latvia's population has fallen from approximately 2.7 million at independence in 1991 to somewhere below 1.9 million today. Lithuania's decline is less dramatic but follows the same trajectory. In both cases, the primary driver is not economic crisis, but economic opportunity, specifically, the opportunity to earn in Germany or Ireland or the United Kingdom what cannot be earned in Riga or Vilnius, while spending on housing and services at the lower costs of a Western European city rather than the lower wages of a Baltic one. EU freedom of movement is, in this context, a force that operates asymmetrically. It is an unambiguous benefit for the individual Latvian or Lithuanian who takes advantage of it. For the cities and countries they leave, it functions as a continuous slow drain on the human capital that those countries invested in producing. The hospital that trained the nurse, who now works in a Stockholm clinic, the university that educated the software engineer who contributes to a Berlin startup's tax base, the parents who raised the ambitious young person who sends money home, but whose children, if they have them, will not grow up speaking Latvian or Lithuanian. Riga's historic center, the beautiful medieval Hanseatic city that draws tourists and generates the coverage that places it on European city break lists, is increasingly a shell around a city whose population is insufficient to maintain its own infrastructure at the density those buildings were designed for. Schools in the capital have been consolidating for years. Public transport routes are being rationalized downward. The apartment buildings in the residential neighborhoods around the historic core are filling with retirees and emptying of everyone else. The diaspora maintains a relationship with these cities that is genuine and often intensely felt. Latvians and Lithuanians abroad return for summers, for festivals, for Christmas. They send remittances. They maintain the language. They identify as Latvian or Lithuanian in ways that are not merely performative, but a city cannot be maintained by remittances and seasonal visits. A city is maintained by people who are there on Tuesday mornings in November when there are no tourists and no festivals and nothing to document. Those people are leaving, and the demographic projections suggest that the rate of departure will not reverse without interventions that neither country has yet found the political will to implement at the required scale. Sofia presents a version of emptiness that is architecturally visible in ways that the other cities are not. The Bulgarian capital has been growing physically for 30 years. New apartment complexes have risen in rings around the city's Soviet-era residential blocks and its older central districts. The skyline, if viewed from the right angle, suggests a city in the middle of a construction boom. And in a technical sense, that is what it is. The apartments being built are not primarily being purchased by Bulgarians who live in Sofia. They are being purchased by Bulgarians who live in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in Spain, in the United States. They are investment properties, pension funds expressed in concrete and glass, a stake in the homeland maintained from a distance. They are purchased as security and rarely occupied. Their windows are dark on most evenings. Their letterboxes fill with uncollected mail. This produces a city that is simultaneously overdeveloped and underinhabited. The infrastructure required to service all those buildings, the roads, the utilities, the public transport, the schools, is being constructed for a population that does not exist in those buildings. The human density required to make a neighborhood function as a neighborhood, the foot traffic, the corner shops, the informal social density of people who walk the same streets every day and recognize each other is absent from large sections of the city, despite the presence of the physical buildings that should, in principle, house them. Sofia is experiencing a form of emptiness that has no precise historical precedent because it is an emptiness produced by prosperity rather than poverty. The people who own those dark apartments are not poor. They are not refugees. They are working professionals and retirees who made rational financial decisions and happen to have made them in a way that is hollowing out the urban fabric of the city they left. The Bulgarians who remain in Sofia are aware of this in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding ungrateful for investment. They live in a city that is visibly expanding while functionally contracting. They drive past construction cranes on their way to schools that have declining enrollment. They watch neighborhoods fill with buildings and empty of people. They understand, without necessarily being able to explain it in policy terms, that something is architecturally present and humanly absent in large portions of the city where they live. Brussels is the anomaly in this analysis because it is, on paper, one of the most important cities in Europe, the headquarters of the European Union's institutions, the nominal capital of NATO, a city that draws a disproportionate share of continental, political, and bureaucratic power simply by virtue of being the place where the negotiations happen and the directives are drafted and the summits are held. It is also a city that has been failing to cohere as a city for so long that the failure has become normalized, woven into the fabric of Belgian political culture as something between a running joke and an open wound. The division between Flemish and French speaking Belgium is not a new problem. It dates to the linguistic politics of the 19th century and has been managed, rather than resolved, through an increasingly elaborate federal architecture that has produced one of the most complex systems of overlapping governance in the democratic world. Belgium has managed to hold regional, community, federal, and European elections in configurations that require citizens to vote for multiple layers of government that are themselves in perpetual negotiation with each other about which layer is responsible for which function. The practical consequences for Brussels are significant and daily. Public transport that is funded and managed by multiple entities with overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting priorities. School systems that operate in parallel linguistic tracks in a city where the linguistic boundary runs through neighborhoods and sometimes through families. A municipal governance structure for the 19 communes of the Brussels capital region, that is, by the assessment of its own administrators, not fit for the scale of governance required by a city of 2 million people that serves as the administrative center of a continent. The young Belgians who leave Brussels, and they leave in significant numbers, to Ghent and Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to London, to Berlin, are not fleeing poverty or political repression. They are making a quiet judgment that the city's structural dysfunctions make it an inferior environment for the life they want to build. The housing market, inflated by the presence of European institutions and the salaries attached to them, is no longer accessible to young people on ordinary Belgian wages. The quality of public services is inconsistent in ways that are particularly felt in the neighborhoods that are not the European quarter. The sense that the city's governance is perpetually captured by the negotiation between its linguistic communities and therefore perpetually unable to focus on the things that a city's residents actually need from it. Brussels remains, for those who work in the European bubble, a functional and often pleasant place to live. For those outside it, the bubble is both visible and increasingly impermeable. A city divided between those who are there because Europe chose it and those who were there first and are now being priced and discouraged out of it. The pattern that runs through these 8 cities and through the others that could have been added to this list, Zagreb and Budapest and Bucharest, each carrying their own variations of the same structural logic, is not difficult to identify once it becomes visible. The difficulty is that it becomes visible too slowly and at too many removes from any single legible cause to generate the crisis response that might address it. Cities are not lost to visible catastrophe. They are lost to the accumulation of decisions that each made sense individually and collectively produced a destination that was not chosen and is not acknowledged. A golden visa program designed to attract investment. An Airbnb platform that offers apartment owners a rational financial choice. A free movement zone that allows young people to seek better opportunities. A tax policy designed to attract corporate headquarters. A planning regime that approves construction without distinguishing between housing that will be inhabited and housing that will be financialized. A tourism strategy that prioritizes visitor numbers over the well-being of the people who actually live in the place being visited. None of these decisions is inherently wrong. Each of them, in isolation, has a reasonable economic justification. Together they constitute a process through which cities are converted, gradually and without announcement, from places where life is lived to products through which value is extracted. The residents who understand this most clearly are not the urban planners or the economists. They are the people who leave. Not the obvious emigrants in search of dramatic opportunity, but the quieter departures, the family that moves from the center to the periphery because the center is no longer affordable, the young professional who chooses another city, not because it is dramatically better, but because it is simply more manageable, the grandmother who sells the apartment that her mother left her because the offer was too good and the maintenance costs too high, and the neighborhood too changed to feel like home anymore. These departures do not register as crises because they are individual decisions made for individual reasons. Aggregated over a decade, they constitute the slow evacuation of a city's irreplaceable human inheritance. The social knowledge, the intergenerational bonds, the informal community structures that took centuries to accumulate and that cannot be rebuilt by urban planning initiatives, however well funded and however earnestly intended. What makes all of this more than a European problem is the question it forces about what a city actually is, not what it looks like from the outside, from a photograph, from a tourism advertisement, from a GDP figure, what it is from the inside, from the perspective of the person who lives there through all seasons, not the good ones, who navigates its dysfunctions every day and still, somehow finds it worth navigating because the alternative is to become the person who left. Cities are not their skylines, they are not their monuments. They are not their tourism arrival statistics or their hotel occupancy rates or their ranking in the annual surveys of the world's most livable places that are compiled by organizations whose methodology rewards the expensive and penalizes the human. Cities are the bond between a place and its people, not abstract people, not tourist people, not investment visa people, the specific people who were formed by that place and who form it in return, who carry in their habits and their memories and their expectations a kind of knowledge about how to inhabit that specific place that took generations to accumulate. When that bond breaks, not dramatically, not with a headline, but gradually, through the arithmetic of unaffordability and the quiet calculus of departure, what remains is not a city in decline. It is something more disorienting than that. It is a city that continues to look exactly like itself while becoming something else entirely. The tourist who arrives in Lisbon in search of the authentic Alfama finds instead a very convincing performance of the authentic Alfama. It is not dishonest. The buildings are real, the tiles are real, the fado is real. But the people who made those things what they are have moved to the periphery, or to France, or to a neighborhood that has not yet been discovered and repriced and converted into product. The photograph looks the same. The city it documents has changed in ways that a photograph cannot capture, and a tourism board has no incentive to acknowledge. There is a word in Portuguese, saudade, that describes a longing for something you love that is absent, or may never have existed, or may be lost forever. It is the emotional register in which fado is performed, the mood in which the Alfama was always most fully itself. It is also, if the trajectories visible in these cities continue without intervention, the emotion in which they will eventually be remembered. Not with bitterness, not with rage, with the particular melancholy of something beautiful that was allowed to slip away because no single moment of loss was dramatic enough to arrest the attention of the people who might have prevented it. Empires do not fall in a day. Cities do not die in a day. They fall in patterns. They die in departures. The question that each of these cities is now being asked, whether they can hear it clearly enough, in the silence left by the people who have already gone, is whether the thing that was built here over centuries is worth the extraordinary effort and political difficulty of preserving it. Not the buildings, not the monuments, not the views that will photograph beautifully for another 100 years, regardless of what happens to the people who live among them, the city, the living one, the one that breathes and argues and makes things and raises children in streets it has inhabited for generations. That city is quieter than it was. In some of these places, it is very quiet indeed. The question is whether it has already gone silent, or whether there is still, if you listen carefully enough, something left to save.